Other people are difficult. They are difficult to understand, their motives esoteric and mysterious, and mired in this thick fog that I cannot seem to look past. It seems that this fog, however, may go both ways, as others seem not to understand my motives as well. To my own perception, I believe that I behave and take action in an extremely internally consistent manner. My axioms, my underlying reasons may not make sense to other people, but they do make sense to me. Others, on the other hand, oftentimes it appears to me as if they do not have underlying reasons at all. They have underlying emotions, motivations, but not an underlying set of values that govern them, beyond vague aesthetics. Aesthetics such as certain things which induce disgust should be avoided, certain things which cause fear ought to be avoided, with no deeper understanding of why those things induce those feelings. And so it has often been the case that I struggle to relate to others. Initially, I suspected that this was the famous autism double empathy gap, or the double empathy problem. I've heard it referred to as both. And indeed, I do encounter it more with those of the allistic persuasion, those who are non-autistic. That being said, I cannot identify if this is because most people I interact with are allistic. Because I have encountered this problem with fellow autistic individuals as well, and I do not entirely buy into the idea that autistic people inherently have more empathy for other autistic people. The source of much of my struggles with interpersonal conflict and interaction has been this gap in fundamentals of empathy, where I tend to have an easier time empathizing with logic and underlying motives, even if I do not relate to those motives, so long as they are concrete. However, I falter and struggle when relating to others behaving in a manner that is purely rooted in underlying emotion without underlying rationale. And I suppose it is in part my fault for treating humans as if they behave logically consistently, because I know that is not the case. That is not how humans develop, and that is not how humans learn. In fact, I believe that I am not as logical as I think I am. Of course, I have these underlying rationales, and I do behave consistently with those rationales, but those rationales themselves are derived in an illogical fashion, and so that, too, is irrational. However, now I see these not as one superior process and one inferior process. I used to think that way. I used to see my internally consistent process as inherently superior to the inconsistent process of others. But if the underlying mechanisms in both cases are irrational, that is to say, not derived from reason, then are they not both equally irrational, even if one is more logical than the other? And in fact, even if one is more logical in the strict propositional sense than the other, that may in fact make it less intuitive for others that find that intuition or non propositional ways of interacting with information, particularly to do with emotional information, they may find that more intuitive than my propositional way of interacting with emotional information. Thusly, my major struggle in interacting with allistic people often boils down to that, though with other autistic people, it also boils down to that. And so I find myself a bit of an anomaly. I have course, of course, I have met other autistic people who behave and think in internally consistent manners, though, of course, all underlying rationales are themselves irrational, though those are few and far between. And I have also met allistic people who have concrete underlying rationales, though those themselves are derived from an irrational and emotive basis. They are also internally consistent. So I do not believe that this is a problem of me being autistic and others not being autistic, though I had initially observed the problem as such. I think, in fact, there may be a selection bias on my part, in which I tend to interact with people who are going to be more persuaded towards internal consistency. At least I try to, though of course I have several people I interact with who do not behave that way. And I do enjoy their company, of course, though I struggle to understand them. And so I wonder where this difference comes from. Is it a matter of upbringing? Is it a matter of something inherent to how the brain processes values and places values on ideas? I'm not entirely sure, though I hope to eventually uncover the truth of the matter for myself. It's past midnight right now, and I have been contemplating. I have had a rough day. I often have rough days. As do we all, I suppose. Though I find that the ways in which my days end up being rough tend to be different than days that others have that are also rough. In that, when I have a rough day, there is an internally consistent and predictable mechanism by which it happens. This is both confusing and comforting. Confusing to my surroundings, who seem confused as to why it seems to operate the way it does. Comforting because I know how long it will last and when it will end and how to plan around it. That does not make it any less rough, however. In fact, it can make it more frustrating because I know for how long my malady, my internal malady, shall persist. But I know not how to escape it before that projected termination of the status. I sometimes wonder, as I have often wondered, if I am something of a biological automaton, because I operate in predictable yet nonsensical ways, while others operate in nonsensical yet predictable ways. The spontaneity in them that makes them so frustrating for me is what makes them human, whereas the predictability in me is so hidden that I end up being confusing, like a computer with a virus, and you don't know what the problem is, but you know that for some reason, turning it off and on again seems to work. I have often faced allegations that I behave in a robotic or automaton like manner. People have alleged this about the way I speak as well, though I can speak in a more animated tone as well, though that in itself was acquired through mimicry of external sources. My natural cadence does tend to be on the more robotic side. I suppose that becomes the next topic of discussion, is that there is this disconnect between my sense of self and my sense of what human is, what personable is, what personhood is, because it often feels like I do not bear the necessary qualities. I know in a more abstract sense I do, and that feeling these things, feeling these internal conflicts and internal conflagrations, is what makes me human. But if we are to take human, at least in the more social sense of being compatible with other humans, I do not feel human in that sense, and it seems that others do not perceive me as such either, and they grow frustrated when they try to perceive me as such. I have gained much and I have lost much from this outlook. I'm not quite sure what the flaw is and where the flaw is, but I know that it is flawed because it does not seem to serve me well, and thought processes that do not serve me well, that do not allow me to adapt, they must be flawed in some way, though I have yet to identify how. I suppose I will get there one day. I suppose part of the way that I think the way I do is due to this interesting mix of hypercompetence and perennial incompetence that pervades me. I would describe myself as relatively high functioning for an autistic person, though I would also describe myself as requiring very substantial support, moderate support needs. What this in effect manifests is that when I am functioning within a very narrow band of functioning, I am hyper competent. I can do much and I can do very, very well. But that is only because everything else is accounted for. When things are not accounted for, my ability to function crumbles. And I think that perhaps this may be part of why I understand myself in such a robotic manner, because it often feels like I am a computer. There are parameters, set parameters in which I function, optimized towards a specialized set of tasks, like most technologies are. Yet outside of those tasks and without proper maintenance, without power, and without a good antivirus software, the computer ceases functioning as it ought to. And in that way, the computer is predictable. But even though the computer is predictable, to the lay person who does not understand computers, computers seem to function like magic. You don't know why your computer is quote unquote glitching out. All you know is that it is not working. I often hear those who are less tech savvy say that they do not do anything complicated with their computers because they are afraid that it will break. This is, of course, silly because computers don't just break for no reason. There are methods to avoid any breakages, and there are fail-safes because computers function in a logical manner. That doesn't make it any less frustrating, however, when a computer ceases to work. And it in fact seems esoteric and mystical when a computer does cease to work to the average person, and even to those who are more tech savvy. Perhaps this is what I appear like to the average person, or the person who is not me, who is, I suppose, the average person, because all non self individuals are average compared to the self, who is posited as exceptional in a self centric manner. I wonder if I appear like a computer that runs on magic and ceases functioning on magic. I tend to see other people much like fairies, with esoteric, strange motivations that I do not quite understand, just like the fairies that you read about in old fairy tales. What I'm trying to say is ultimately being myself is complicated. I suppose this is the case for everyone. Everyone's self is complicated. Though everyone is complicated in different ways, and it's just taking me quite a bit of time to unpack why I am complicated and why my life is part of the dialectical process, is engaging in dialogue that unpacks it as such. My hope is that this recording will serve that function for myself. This has been Seventh Pine, also known as Piney, the second episode of Piney's Diatribes. Late at night, signing off. Goodbye.